Hello and welcome to another episode of the Psychosocial Distancing Podcast, book read, whatever you'd like to call it. I'm one of your hosts, Daniel Chadbourne. With me is Thomas Brooks.
Hello, hello.
So we are halfway through the book. We spent 3 episodes on chapter 6. We have 6 chapters to go. And we were kind of debating with ourselves what to do. We have some guests lined up, but not quite yet. And so those chapters are on hold right now. We are going to have our midterms.
Get out your Scantrons, kids.
And yeah, we're gonna ask a bunch of questions. I'm gonna start with multiple choice, and then
Make sure you have your number 2 pencil.
We're not gonna lose every one of the half dozen people who listen to us right now. So what we're gonna do in this episode is kind of go off chapter, but we're gonna talk about arguably 2 of the most famous studies in all of psychology. Definitely in social psychology, but I think we can make an argument that they have become iconic and in many ways taken on lives of their own. There are movies, there are documentaries. Everyone's generally recommending me some movie that has come out. There was one that came out a couple of years ago on one of these. I have still yet to see it. And I might not after everything that I've researched for this particular topic. So we are going to be talking about Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo, and Stanley Milgram's study on obedience and Philip Zimbardo's famous Stanford Prison Study.
Dun, dun, dun.
I've titled this, Milgram v. Zimbardo, Clash of the Titans.
Ding, ding.
Yeah, so just to kind of throw a heads up, I've thrown in 2 articles for the podcast, and we'll talk about stuff that's contained in these articles throughout. One is probably the most critical news article that's freely available that's ever been written on the Zimbardo, the Stanford Prison Study, and the other is a very critical article on the Milgram study. So we're going to kind of get into, they both have problems. They both have a lot of misconceptions about what actually happened, and a lot of that's basically lost to the annal, or at least was until very recently, lost to the annals of history. A lot of this stuff is coming out recently because all we've really had to go on were what these famous psychologists said happened. There are people who are left out. There's further intrigue. There's denial of tenure. This story has everything. And so I was almost thinking that we should sort of start this up. I wish I had as soothing a voice as the host of This American Life. Like Act 1. And move in to these topics. So that's kind of how I have my outline of what we're going to be talking about today. But I think we've both found some sort of juicy pieces of detail that neither one of us has heard about. And then besides these controversial articles, I have 2 YouTube videos. They're documentaries. One is the documentary. It's like 10, 15 minutes long on obedience. It gives you kind of the actual footage from the study. It's a very bare bones.
Milgram study?
The Milgram study, yes.
The Milgram study.
And then the other, I was looking around, Vsauce has a entire show on kind of mind-related stuff, and they did one on the Stanford Prison Study. But in watching these, and maybe watching these in retrospect, can offer some additional insight, because there's a lot that these documentaries and this information that has come out recently has never been included in any of these. They were very biased. I mean, even the recent movie, the recent Stanford Prison Study, or Stanford Prison Experiment, SPE is what it shows up in all the research. They heavily wash out some key players in this story, some things that records have uncovered over the last couple of years, transcripts of actual conversations had as part of these studies. And at some point, maybe we'll end with a bias of the week, because I think I found a bias that kind of fits our theme.
Before we begin, though, I did want to ask, have you seen the Milgram study movie?
I have not. I haven't seen any of them. And
the Milgram one's pretty good. It's called The Experimenter.
Yeah.
And it has Winona Ryder in it.
Okay.
And so it was on Netflix for a little bit, but
It's
I
probably still there. I know that
fully enjoyed that one.
the BBC turned the study that we'll be talking about into a documentary, the big replication study. That's why it's called the BBC Prison Study.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm kind of sour. And maybe at some point we'll talk about this. Maybe when we move into season 2 and we do an intro psych book, I'll talk about the Viggo Mortensen Freud movie, Freud Young movie.
Oh, wait,
Because
the Dangerous Method.
yes, because I went in that really expecting it to be something a whole lot different than it was.
You didn't expect some
I didn't expect to be about Young's salacious relationship with his patient.
Sabina Spielheim.
Yeah.
Spank me, Daddy Yoon.
Yeah, so I was not expecting that. And that kind of turned me off to psych movies for a while, having I'm like, no, like I honestly, just a whole movie about Freud and Jung getting upset at each other would make for great programming. But
the one thing I did like about A Dangerous Method that I think isn't talked enough about, and we kind of touched on this in our first episode, was kind of the conflict between the Jewish and the Gentile psychologists of Europe before World War II, and kind of how they were positioning themselves with the oncoming Nazis and Nazi ideology.
Yeah.
I thought that did a really good job of, because like we don't really talk about that in our classes, that it's not like this holistic group, or like we think of it as like Freud being the master psychologist kicking people out willy-nilly, but there was also that Jew-Gentile tension underneath as well.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely enjoyed it as a movie, and there were aspects that I learned kind of historically about it. It was definitely not the movie I was expecting. So I should probably read what the movie's about before I watch it.
Maybe that's what we should do, like in between this book season and the next one, is go through and do like 4 or 5 episodes over, like reviewing different psych movies.
I think that'd be great.
Yeah.
And then we'll have to start with these two. So Milgram and Zimbardo. So Act 1. The players in this game.
Oh, Lord.
So I went and pulled up some history just to give people some background of who these titans of psychology are. And there's this little interesting bit of information that I found. And I just, it's really interesting that we're kind of talking about both of them. Both of them have become these kind of icons within psychological, modern psychological history. So Stanley Milgram was born in 1933 to a family of Jewish immigrants to New York. He attended James Monroe High School, where he quickly earned a reputation as a hard worker and finished in 3 years. He went on to Queens College to earn a bachelor's in political science and could not get into Harvard because he had never taken a psychology class. So he fixed it and then went to Harvard for graduate school, where he worked with Gordon Allport.
Oh.
And he earned his PhD in social psychology in 1960. A year later, he would go on, or that year, he would go on to Yale and perform his famous experiments. He eventually went back to Harvard. I don't really have a whole lot of information based on, I was mainly focusing on the research meat of this. But he went back to Harvard in 1963, but was not offered tenure because of the controversy swirling around him, which we will talk about. And was eventually kind of offered a job. He basically finished his time at City University of New York, running their social psychology program. And he remained there until his death in 1984. And then Zimbardo was also born in New York City in 1933. And went to the same high school as Stanley Milgram, James Monroe High School. Yes. I would argue that they were both very hard workers, because he completed his BA with a triple major in psychology, sociology, and anthropology.
Oh, a triple threat.
And worked with Neil Miller, who was a kind of psychologist of renown because of his interest in cross-disciplinary research, particularly that revolving around fear and fear's effects on behavioral responses. Basically, again, your environment influences you behaviorally. He also taught at Yale a year before Milgram showed up, but eventually moved to the New York University College of Arts and Science, then Columbia, and then finally Stanford in 68. And then in the early 70s, I think he published in 73. He did his famous. So, I mean, these are people who grew up in the same area. One of a family of Jewish immigrants. Zimbardo is from a family of Italian immigrants. It's also interesting.
We got a Jew-Gentile dichotomy again.
But what's interesting too is that Zimbardo, it's kind of noted in his bio that part of growing up, because he was of this, I guess, sort of ambiguous immigrant descent, he was confused a lot for being Jewish or for being other ethnicities. And also, if we're talking 1930s, Italians weren't loved a whole lot. We have Irish-Italian parades now, but if you were Italian back in the 30s, you had the KKK out for you, and all these other groups hating you because you were immigrants. That's what it was all about. You weren't
white yet.
Yes, this was pre-white Italian. And so, yeah, that you've got these two sons of immigrants growing up in New York. They go to the same high school, so I mean they're literally growing up together in the same area, and they both go on to work at Yale for a while, and then eventually run these studies that become incredibly prominent. And they're known for a lot. I mean, Milgram is known for more than just that experiment. He's done a lot of research on social interaction, kind of cognitive overload in social environments, and a number of other studies. And Zimbardo, I mean, outside of the controversies we're going to be talking about today, is recent stuff has been things like the Hero Project, talking about how individuals change violent behavior, how modeling heroic activity in your day-to-day life. And it's like, how can you not agree with something like that?
I will say with Zimbardo, though, I've watched a couple of his TED Talks, and he gets really into like the psychology of evil. And I'm like, what is going on here? What are you talking about, sir?
That is one of the biggest criticisms against Zimbardo, is that there are a lot of people who view his whole, as social psychologists, we do harp on the environment a lot. But it almost seems that the concept of the Lucifer effect, it seems that if he's almost taking the person out of it. And he has testified in court to defend people who are involved in serious actions, to make the argument it's not their fault, it's their environment. They didn't make a bad choice, their environment led them to do it. It kind of gets rid of free will to an extent. And in 2015 he did this TED Talk that was tied to this book that he co-authored called Man Disconnected, how technology has sabotaged what it means to be male. That basically said, because all men are now playing video games and we're shut-ins, because of the lack of two-parent households and female-oriented schooling, have made it more attractive to live virtually, risking video game addiction and pornography addiction. And I was like,
no.
Come on.
We'll get into this with one of our guests and kind of talk about the the social hobgoblins that are pornography and video games.
I'm gonna put that on my list to ask him what he thinks of Zimbardo.
Oh, we're gonna get an earful.
I actually work with a colleague who went to Stanford as an undergrad and took Zimbardo's 101 class.
Yeah,
I do not want to share that story because I don't think I can do it justice.
Okay.
It's
I heard, I mean, like, this is just me being a rumor mill, like I don't have any evidence of this, but I heard he's kind of like rude.
I mean,
in a very
I was told that every student in the class had the pleasure of shaking his hand at the end when they turned in their final exam.
Oh Lord.
And I mean, you're talking about an R1 institution, so it's a TA teaching the class that he is supervising.
And by supervising, you mean he's upstairs writing grants and not interacting with his class?
I mean, I don't want to badmouth people at R1 institutions. They might eventually listen to us. But maybe.
It's important work to keep a university floating.
I mean, on one hand, it is. So,
I'm not going to judge that. Like, that's some great teaching experience for grad students. If you want to do that and run your research and write grants, like, more power to you.
yeah.
If you want to do those things.
So yeah, so we have these two researchers. There could be some argument behind ego. I mean, there's what is this? What are the statistics? Only about 1.5% to 2% of the population has a PhD. So it's probably less if we're going back to the 70s, 60s, and you know, maybe there's some ego behind that. That you know, if you're like, I've made it. You also become someone associated with arguably the biggest studies ever done in psychology. It doesn't matter what field you're in. Like, I mean, if there's anything that's going to be talked about outside of maybe Phineas Gage in chapter 1 of an intro psych textbook, it's going to be Milgram and Zimbardo, you know, both with social psychology. And so we have these kind of titans of their era, or soon to be titans of their era, you know, I mean, who would know if we were, you know, in a world where Milgram hadn't passed 35 years ago, that how he would be in this current setting, or what kind of research he would have done in the last 35 years, you know, and again, you know, Zimbardo's recent vita is pretty mixed, you know, man disconnected aside. There's a lot of other stuff that he's interested in. He's doing some work on the effects that military has on socialization, and trying to kind of normalize this integration, you know, help people understand it better for both veterans and active duty soldiers. And again, I'm like, you can't complain about that. That seems to be pretty good stuff. Like, there's definitely something there. And I mean, especially if you're a researcher who's heavily invested in environment, this understanding that you go from this environment that's very regimented, very orderly, and you're expected to just kind of like go back to living as a civilian. Like, it's not easy.
Yeah, it's hard to get out of a system that was designed by social psychologists to cultify.
And so with that, we can move to Act 2.
Act 2.
The studies.
Oh.
So, not maybe the controversy, but I'd like to discuss a little bit about what everyone kind of knows about the studies, and maybe some of the basics that people don't typically know about. But I mean, at this point, and we'll talk about this, when they replicated the Milgram study in 2009, they actually had to disinclude any participants that had ever taken a Psych 101 class.
Fair.
Because you would have heard about it. You know, if you've ever been exposed, I mean, even people, again, who have never taken a Psych 101 class, who have never, you know, been a part of psychology, have probably at least by proxy heard of something along the lines of one of these studies. But as I think we'll get into, and I guess what I'm calling Act 3, you know, everything else, that there's a lot of misconceptions, because what we know and what's typically taught, I mean, what I have taught for the last 10 years, up until this semester, because I've got a whole lot more information in my wheelhouse, and really over the last couple of years, a whole lot more information has come out, has been pretty straightforward and predominantly directed by the researchers themselves. The knowledge that we have is based on what Milgram and Zimbardo want to tell us, or wanted to tell us. What they put into books, what they talked about in interviews, what other people have talked about. And there have been people like, especially in the Zimbardo study, where they have interviewed a lot of the participants as adults, or as older adults, that just haven't been interested in ever talking about it again. They're just like, I'm done. Or as we'll talk about in the Milgram study, you know, ran away and never came back, and that caused problems.
Yeah. So I guess we should kind of outline what these two studies were first, because we can assume that our listeners have heard of these studies, but like what was done?
Yeah. So the Milgram study really starts out of, I think at the beginning in our first podcast, I mentioned that World War II created a lot of interest in social psychology. And so there were social psychologists beginning to step up. And the Milgram study represents arguably one of these. It's at least the way it's been told is that Milgram went to his department and even asked people like, hey, we're going to be running this study. This is what we're going to be doing. Like, what do you like? What are your thoughts? Do you think that anyone's going to go far with it? And then kind of what's been reported on it is that, a lot of the responses he got were, no, not really. We like to think the best in people. And so maybe 1%, maybe 2%.
Yeah, because he was interested in like the average German citizen. Like, why were they complicit or active in the Holocaust? Whether they had good morals or not. Like, were they distinctly an evil group of people, or were the conditions set that any group of people could fall into that behavior?
Right. And I mean, you even just think about like the average rank and file soldier. I mean, we do know now that, we're talking about, concentration camps, when they say that these soldiers had an out, well, some of them, a lot of them, most of them did. They could have been transferred. They could have chosen not to work there. But, why does someone stick around? Why does someone, I think it's easy for a lot of people to understand like why a soldier would kind of go to war for his country. Like just your average rank and file person on the battlefield, not necessarily, the people working at camps. But what Milgram wanted to see is that could you take that average person? Could you take that person who was conscripted? Could you take, John Smith off the street, this white collar worker or this blue collar worker? Could you put them in a situation where there's this authority, and could the authority prompt them to do something terrible? And that's essentially what he did. He constructed this elaborate experiment. So in true research design, it's not a true experiment.
Right. There was no control.
Nothing was manipulated. At best, it's maybe a quasi-experimental study. So it appears, but nothing's manipulated. Or at best, at worst, it's a non-experimental study. So it's observational. You are just observing behavior under circumstances. Now, I guess we can argue that like later replications of this, if you combined them, could become an experiment, because you could compare one to the other. So it'd be like a between group study. So yeah, he constructed this elaborate study. There's this really great, and I think it's on Vimeo, because Vimeo doesn't copyright strike you. That there's this BBC document. So it's kind of like a Frontline, Dateline type show, but for the BBC. And there's an episode on where they do a replication. They bring in 12 British citizens in, I think it's like 2009, 2010, and they run them through the full study. They have a psychologist on hand from one of the universities. He's overseeing the study. He's explaining what's going on. It's probably one of the best videos I've ever seen on it, because it kind of gets to what we'll be talking about in part 3, is that there are these replications and there are these follow-up studies. And of the two, while there are concerns about both, one of these two holds up.
Right.
So Milgram sets up this study where participants are going to come in and they're told that they're participating in a learning study. So the basic behavioral psychology is that if you punish someone for doing something bad or wrong, they'll may be less likely to do it again. And so you're told that you're either going to be a teacher or a learner. The learner gets hooked up to the shock generator, and the teacher reads from a series of questions, and every question the learner gets wrong, they get a shock. And those shocks get progressively worse as time goes on. What the participant doesn't know is that the learner is an actor, or the guy who will be the learner is an actor. He's a guy in a white shirt. He's a middle-aged man. The experimenter, this guy in a lab coat, he's also fake. He's not Stanley Milgram. He's not a psychologist. I've heard, depending on the story and how it's told, that he's a gym teacher or like a high school biology teacher or something like that. He just looks the part. He's wearing a lab coat. That's all you
Yeah,
have
and the
to do.
participant believes that there's like a 50-50 chance that they're the learner or the teacher.
They have to draw little papers from a hat or something like that, and it's rigged. They both say teacher on them, so that no matter what they draw, and then the other person just pretends that they got learner.
Right.
And they really tried to ramp up the realism in this study too, because they watched the guy in the white shirt, this learner, get strapped into a chair. He gets strapped into these leather cuffs where he's going to be shocked. He's on the other side of the glass, and then they walk into this room, and there's this huge shock generator. It goes from 15 to 450 volts and 15-volt increments. I like to tell my students that, to put this into context, your average light socket has or light bulb socket or plug in the wall has 110 volts. I used to work electrical at a hardware store. I at least know this. If you're in Britain, it's 220 is the standard main line. And so we're talking about 4 times American, 2 times British. You get shocked while you're, and there's more. I mean, there's honestly, if you know anything about electricity, you might start to be skeptical. So if you bring in like a contractor to do this study, they might go, well, voltage isn't the same as amperage, and there's other stuff going on. But they actually hook them up, and they give them a 45-volt shock. So they, again, add that realism. This is what it's going to feel like. I really like the signs that are on the shock generator.
Right. It like lets you know whenever you're in the deadly zone.
Yeah, so it's like mild, moderate voltage, or danger, severe shock, or severe voltage, and then it gets to the end. It just says XXX. Like a cartoon poison bottle. Like a skull and crossbones would be just as appropriate for that.
Right.
Yeah,
you have to change that for a modern, or I guess a present day study, because then they'll just think porn switch.
And then Zimbardo would get upset because they have the potential to become addicted to it. So Milgram, they sit down. The guy in the lab coat sits behind them in a desk, and they start the study. And as the study goes on, I think it's at about 75 volts. The guy starts complaining. Now, all these are recorded, which again, I mean, we're thinking about experimental design is kind of a genius move. I'll give Milgram that, because everyone gets the same voice. Everyone gets the same screaming. Everyone gets the same complaints. So it's standardized. Now, many of them may not know that this is fake, which is also part of the problem. But you're trying to add to that realism. And so at about 75 or so volts, the guy starts complaining, or he complained a little bit before that. I think it's at about 75-ish volts. He says that he has a heart condition. He starts screaming not too long after. And so it's at some point, inevitably, the participant turns back. And this is one of... So there is an earlier version of this study where the guy in the lab coat says nothing. He just lets them run through the study. The one that we tend to talk about the most is study number 2, which is where he starts, when they say like, hey, this guy says he has a heart condition. This guy's screaming. What should I do? Like, I don't want to hurt this guy. And so he says stuff like, please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. My personal favorite prompt, because it's the most disturbing one when you think about it, and like favorite in a dark sort of way,
right,
is they're like, I'm worried I'm gonna hurt him, and the guy in the lab coat goes, there'll be no permanent tissue damage, please continue. Like, but that does imply that there could still be tissue damage,
right? Yeah.
And so so this goes on, and the estimates that come out of kind of the story of, like, we went to graduate students, we went to the other faculty, we said, we're running this study, how many people do you think? And they said about 1% to 2%. It was about 2/3 of participants. So about 65-ish% went all the way to 450 volts. I think the British replication that the BBC aired in this little show did a great job, because they brought 10 people in, and like 7 of them went all the way to the end. And they did ask them afterwards. They asked both the people who walked away and the people who stayed, why? Like, why did you keep going? And they brought out a lot of really good answers. And I like kind of highlighting, these different reasons. That some people said that they were kind of distracted because they're given this test.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're so focused on the test, you're not realizing that this guy is in as much trouble. You're trying to do 2 things at once. Though, when you get to, I think it's like about 250, like 300 volts, like the guy just stops talking. Like he's screaming like top of his lungs at one point. It just goes silent.
Mm-hmm.
And if they turn back to the guy in the lab coat, he goes, treat no response as a wrong answer. Please continue.
Yeah.
And they keep going for another like 15 trials. There are other people who, kind of rationalize to themselves that like, this can't be real, that the guy's not hooked up or something. And then when they're debriefed, they usually say like, this is kind of what I expected, even though they show this intense relief on their face. And it's also not saying that these people were kind of like stone faced the whole time. Milgram even notes in his original study, like they're putting their head in their hands, they're pulling at their hair. These people showed serious signs of nervousness.
Yeah, if you watch like the experiment video that was captured and posted, like you see like the participants like very distressed by what's going on.
Yeah. It's this idea that, and again, it kind of calls that into question. Like, maybe you can get someone to that point to do this, but can you get them to do it without it bothering them?
Mm-hmm.
Arguably, no. I mean, some people.
What my question would be is, if we're trying to make a one-to-one comparison with the Milgram experiment and say the Holocaust, does that stress go down the more you do the thing?
And I mean, there's probably an argument there. The more and more you do it, the more you have to kind of live. I mean,
it becomes normalized.
You normalize it. Yeah.
You said 60 to 70%. One of the studies that I pulled for this, the replication, was from 2017. And they were interested in looking at like gender differences between teacher and learner and stuff, but they couldn't come up with any variance because 90% of their participants went all the way. And so they had huge ceiling effects. So they were like, well, we can't confirm our hypothesis because like nearly everyone in our study went all the way.
That's kind of heartbreaking.
Right. Do we want to criticize the study before we move on to Zimbardo, and then we can
let's just let that hang there. Let's talk about Zimbardo, and then we'll go into replications and criticisms.
Okay.
Because I kind of like the idea of letting the traditional story hang out there for a little bit, letting it kind of process, percolate, whatever we want to call it. So we then move to, it's about a decade later. Philip Zimbardo gets a grant from the Naval Research Center to do a study on prison life. Or generally the concept is that how your environment can influence you. Mm-hmm. Now, there's some additional stuff that goes into the creation of this and the follow-up. And I'm gonna kind of leave that out because that's tied into some of the, because at this point, if you're taking a Psych 101 class, and the research tends to show this, odds are your professor does not know this.
Right. And I have a little bit of stats to back this one up.
Yeah.
When we get to our criticisms.
Yeah. And I'll say, as someone who has taught this for almost a decade, learning about it, and again, has gone through a PhD program and a master's program and got my bachelor's degree, my understanding of these 2 studies are kind of as I'm telling them now. Up until about a year or 2 ago, when a lot of this new research, 2019, 2020, a lot of this new research came out. So Zimbardo's interested in looking at how environment can affect the person. Specifically, if your environment sets up expectations of roles. So how are you supposed to act as a prison guard? How are you supposed to act as a prisoner? That individuals will conform to those roles. And if those roles are maladaptive, if, let's say, it is fine for you to be a terrible person as a prison guard, or if we're talking about this in like current events, it's that idea that someone who goes from being an employee to a manager, their personality changes in different ways because this new authority has been given to them. Or there's an expectation. Hey, you're supposed to be cutthroat as a manager. You're supposed to be unethical to get ahead. Then you kind of become those expectations. And so Zimbardo sets himself up as the prison director. He has a warden. My original understanding was that he was the warden, but no, it turns out this other guy, Jaffe, Jaffe, was the warden. Jaffe was the warden.
Apologies to all the Yaffes out there if I'm mispronouncing your name.
Yeah, he's a very influential figure in this story who is not told in this story. We'll talk about him in Act 3. And they bring in a bunch of people who sign up for this study. They randomly assign them. They all reply to this newspaper ad saying you can earn $15 a day. Huge money in 1973. You basically can work all summer, or you can work for 2 weeks, 14 days on this study, and you're set. So they get randomly assigned as prisoners or guards. The guards are asked to report to the university. They convert the Stanford psychology department basement into a prison. They turn a supply closet into solitary confinement. You basically have enough room to kind of stand in it because of all the old drawers and shelves and stuff that are in there. They convert a couple of offices into prison cells. They put barred doors, cots. And so the prison guards show up, and they're given whistles, kind of billy clubs, batons, that they're told they can't physically hurt anyone, even though they have them. They can hit.
Given their phallic symbol and
right.
Rah.
They're also given big reflective sunglasses, kind of add to that de-individuation we're talking about last time, and khaki uniforms. They're also briefed and told kind of what their expectations are. Now, if you're watching the documentary or you're listening to this in class, it's mostly about this is what you can't do. You can't hurt the people. This is what the situation is what we have to kind of go through every day. Sort of normal, like, logistical stuff. And then they go out and have police officers arrest everyone else because they want to make it real.
Right.
And again, this is kind of a clever, hey, you want to create this kind of psychological realism. You're told that you're going to be part of the study, and the police show up to pick you up. And you get drugged to the basement of the Stanford prison, and you are deloused, or you have talcum powder thrown on you to mimic delousing. You are given a smock with a number on it. That is you for the rest of this study. You're given slippers and a stocking cap and a blanket so that you can go into your room. And Zimbardo, in one of these documentaries, basically says, this could have been the most boring study ever performed in psychology. And I think he was right. There was always the possibility that nothing was going to happen.
Yeah.
That the prisoners weren't going to do anything, that the guards weren't going to do anything. And
they were all just going to sit there and be bored in the Stanford Psychology building basement.
And there were some interviews that we'll talk about in Act 3 that kind of said it to that effect. There were some people who went in as prisoners I'm just going to sit around for 14 days and get paid. But after day one, everything goes to hell. The prisoners start rebelling. The guards start behaving aggressively to their authority being threatened, or at least this is how it's worded. I'm trying to leave little breadcrumbs of where some of the problems might be. See if anyone hits these marks. So the idea is that it kind of creates this dichotomy, this split. When authority is threatened, the guards start kind of developing their own psychological torture. They blow their whistles all through the night. They bang on the metal bars with their clubs to make noise. If you don't listen, you get to go in solitary confinement. We'll make you clean the toilets with a toothbrush or your bare hands. We'll make you come out
They
of
don't
your...
do like sit-ups, like push-ups forever, didn't they?
Yeah, push-ups, jumping jacks, other exercises, like just wake you up at 3 a.m. to do that.
Very culty.
Yeah, so they do that they do note in the original, like in a lot of these documentaries, there were some guards that were nice, or at least nice-ish, that would do like small favors for the prisoners, or that would never really engage in some of these behaviors. But there were a couple. The big one, John Wayne, is what they called him. He had a Southern accent. I'm going to find his name. Dave Eshelman. He had a bit of a Southern accent. He kind of came up with kind of almost the most devious, he threw his authority around the most. He was kind of well known in this study when it went on as kind of the cruelest of the guards.
Mm-hmm.
So day 3 rolls around, and one of these guys basically asks to leave. And he goes to Zimbardo, and this is actually in the documentary, which is, again, really interesting because of some of the other stuff we're going to talk about.
Right.
He goes to Zimbardo and says, like, I want out. He gets a meeting with him, and Zimbardo says, look, I'll tell the guards to be easy on you. Like, I'll tell them to calm down with some of the behaviors that they're doing. But maybe you can give me a little insight on what the other prisoners are doing. So basically, the director of the prison just asked you to be a rat.
Mm-hmm.
And that night, this guy has a bit of a nervous breakdown. He starts screaming. He starts yelling. It's usually in every documentary. He's yelling like, I'm on fire, like he's burning up. He's kind of losing his mind. And Zimbardo tells the story that, this guy's losing it. He knows that he needs to let this guy go. And he brings the guy into kind of like their debriefing room and says, we're letting you go. It's over. Like, you can go home. And says that there's this like wave of relief that goes over the guy. I mean, I'd imagine I would feel pretty relieved too.
Right.
There are people talking.
The other prisoners start shaming him, right?
No, he leaves. He's out.
He leaves.
Some of the other prisoners are conforming. Because again, if we're talking about these social systems, we would expect that you would conform to your expected role because it just makes life easier.
Uh-huh.
This new guy comes in. He gets a call because they're 3 days into a 14-day study. And he comes in and the other prisoners are like, welcome to prison.
Uh-huh.
Like, this is real. I don't know what they told you. This isn't a study anymore. They're like, this new guy, they're going to eat him alive. And he eventually, like within like day 4, goes on a hunger strike. Which again, I mean, very apt if you follow any news about people protesting in prison. Well, that's typically what they do because it's one of the few points of power that they have.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's, people talk about they want to try to leave, they want out, they get put in solitary confinement for hours on end. It just keeps getting worse, and they're marching them through the halls, back and forth because they have to go to the restroom. They're constantly being monitored. It's about day 5, day 6, when there's a rumor that starts circulating that the guy that they let go was going to come back with a bunch of people and cause a riot and break them out.
Oh.
And so in the documentary, they talk about how they started disassembling signs off the wall, other stuff. And basically they brought everyone into another building because they were concerned about everyone's safety in the project. And Zimbardo tells it this way. He says that he's sitting out in the hallway and one of his colleagues comes up and is like, hey, so like, what are you doing? Like, what are your variables? Like, what's the study? Like, what are the details? And Zimbardo's freaking out because there's a riot about to happen. At least that's what the news is about. And is like, you don't understand this. Like he's trying to be nice to his colleague, but. And then finally the next day, I think this is finally day 6. The next day, the final day, he's sitting out there and another colleague is kind of witnessing the prisoners being marched back from the bathroom. And the way Zimbardo tells it is that he's sitting there, and this colleague basically says, like, what are you doing? Like, this is demeaning. These are human beings, and like you're kind of putting them through this. Like, this is unethical. And Zimbardo kind of tells it that there's this kind of like realization that finally clicks within him because of like everything that's happened, the threat of the riot. We're 6 days in and things are terrible. Like, where's the next 8 days gonna go? And they decide on day 6 to end the project. So this 14-day study ends on day 6 and arguably becomes the most famous study in all of psychology. And does go on. I mean, they're and again, depends on the textbook that you read on whether or not it's set up as an argument that this was always about trying to show or exemplify prison reform, or if it became something. And that becomes one of the big controversies about it that we'll get into. I don't know if you have anything else to add. I'm used to kind of telling this story once or twice every semester, so I've got my talking points.
Yeah, no, I think that pretty much covers it.
So we've talked about the players in this grand game of famous psychology, or at least the two big names. We've talked about their studies, or at least the narrative of the studies that people have heard. Act 3.
Act 3, the problems.
So what now? So I guess we'll go back to Milgram. We've done like Milgram, Zimbardo, Milgram, and I think we should leave Zimbardo for last.
Yes.
For reasons that will be made clear as we continue. So when you do a search, and I don't know if you came across this on Zimbardo or Milgram, replication, problems, criticisms, there's some discrepancies in what you find.
Yes. There tends to be like two big camps. There's one that says like, this is great, it replicates great, blah, blah, blah. And then the other group that's like, no, this is terrible and you can't replicate it.
Well, I mean, on one hand, and this might be one of the reasons why I think both of these studies have both their popularity, but also their problems. They're not studies that you can easily replicate.
Right.
Because of ethics.
Yeah, because these two studies are kind of the reasons why we have formalized ethics. Because we didn't really get that until after the Zimbardo study.
Yes and no. Because the first ethical guideline, the first APA set of ethics did show up in the 1950s. And they were based on the World Medical Association, some of the World Medical Association findings, things like the Declaration of Helsinki, and of course the Nuremberg trials. But they definitely added. It was kind of one of those moments. We actually had one of these moments. I was a member of the APA for a year. It's super expensive. I just can't keep up. I think it was like $200 as a graduate student to pay my membership and go to their conference. And I was like, I can't afford this every year. But they actually, I was part of the feedback and the fallout with the APA and the Guantanamo torture report. The CIA torture report came out, and it was reported that those two psychologists, that's something we need to talk about for the final. Because
for the final,
that infuriates me. But that was something the APA were trying to rewrite some of their rules about, like, should we just bar all psychologists from being in the room if someone is being potentially tortured? Or like, do we have a duty to possibly help them? And so maybe we should be in there. Like on one hand, like maybe we shouldn't just not torture people. Like I think that's a good solution.
That seems pretty solid.
Because
I
it
wonder why
doesn't
no one saw
work.
that before.
I mean, all of the research says it doesn't work. But you know, who are we? We're not the CIA. Or the psychologists who are paid, the two guys who are paid $80 million to run their torture report.
Oh.
Yeah. So anyway, that's another episode. But yeah, it'd be relatively unethical at most universities to run something like this without a almost completely changing large aspects of the study.
Right.
Unless you could, you know, you'd have to be it'd be really tough. You'd have to be a big name. So I think when we get to people like Riker and Haslam, they're kind of huge names in social psychology right now, that you would need people who have some clout, who have tenure, and who could sit down and take the time to come up with a ironclad risk reward. Yes, there's a risk to doing this, but we have to do, like, we need to replicate this because there might be issues. And then also they're highly relevant. They both represent aspects of human beings having to kind of confront this darker side of human nature and possibly gaining some insight as to why we might do some of the bad things that we do. You know, the environment, the authority figures, the people running the show may lead us down a darker path. And so, you know, understanding that is something I think most people are interested in. I mean, we want to know why people do the things that they do.
Right. Yeah. Not that just that it works, but why it works.
Right. So let's start with Milgram.
Okay. So one of the things, so this is a cutting edge psychology podcast because the Yale archives were released last year. And so this is all of Milgram's notes, transcripts, everything that he decided not to include in his write-ups and reporting and etc. From the Stanford experiment, or not the Stanford experiments, the Yale Milgram study experiments, obviously. And there are some problems. Beyond just the ethical questions that we just outlined, there's some problems in the efficacy of the research and the validity of his original work. And so one of the things that they outlined was that while he admits that not all of his participants were debriefed after the study, there turns out to be way more participants than what he originally reported. So it's about 75% of his 780 participants were not debriefed or de-hoaxed from that experiment, first of all. Which may or may not be a good or bad thing, because about 50% of the participants of his studies didn't even believe that the shocks were real or that the paradigm was real in the first place. And so there are questions as to whether or not your study worked if your participants don't actually believe that they're shocking the person in the other room.
I mean, if there's not any level of realism, and I mean, at the very least, you don't have to make it, I guess, physically real, but it's not even like a psychological realism, or I think what they call mundane realism. That it doesn't have to be physically real. You just have to get the person to believe that it's real.
Right. And so that kind of dichotomy there is like, okay, we're not debriefing participants, and we're also not getting evidence that the participants even believed in the paradigm in the first place. So they were perfectly fine flipping switches because they knew that they weren't actually hurting somebody on the other end. But I think the most concerning one is that in the original write-ups from Milgram, he said that the script for the person who played the researcher was very strict. And the transcripts from the Yale release showed that the experimenter, the person who was the experimenter, went off script regularly. And there was no standardization in the way that the experimenter interacted with participants. So there were also some people were coerced into flipping switches too. It wasn't just like the study requires you to continue. It was like, you have to do this. Come on, this is like this next question, and putting people on the spot to conform.
Yeah, I'm kind of taking that in. I know the other big criticism was part of that de-hoaxing or that debriefing. And part of that is definitely on Milgram for maybe not trying harder to reach out to these people to try to get them. But if someone kind of like barrels away from this shock generator and runs out of your lab,
right, you can't really debrief them.
Right. But that actually did cause a lot of problems, because some of these people went on for the next 30, 40 plus years of their lives completely believing that they, again, if like 50 or so didn't believe in it, well, the other 50 did. And they may have gone the rest of their lives believing that they were capable of doing these sort of harmful actions.
I killed a man inside of a box while he was strapped to electricity while I was giving him word memorization problems.
Right?
Like... Try telling that to your priest.
But I will say that despite this, Milgram actually has a leg up over Zimbardo.
Yeah, I don't think like that. One of the things I think you agree with is that like there may be problems with the original work, but as we've kind of talked about, like 2017 found 90% of the participants still doing it.
2009 found 75%, and then this British replication that they did for the show found that 7 out of the 10 people went all the way, and they were strict. They didn't deviate because it's all on video. I mean, they would. And what I also find really interesting is, despite the fact that there have been researchers who have gotten this replicated, and I guess we'll talk about some of these replications. Milgram also conducted something like 20-odd replications of his study, where he changed little details. So what we typically talk about is that standard Milgram study where the experimenter is talking. There was an earlier version of that where the experimenter just sat there and didn't say anything. There's another version where they start changing things up, like he's not even there. What happens if you take the experimenter away and there's no prompts and there's no authority? You're the authority. They find that it goes down into like 10-20%. Go all the way. Or when you don't even tell them that they need to that they have to increase it, you let them choose to increase it above 15 volts. Almost no one. It's something like 5 to 10% tops in those studies go to 450 volts.
Right.
So this pressure of the experimenter is kind of one of the 3 big factors as to why. Again, you have to have this authority that you believe to be an authority. And we talked about that a couple of weeks ago with the French and Raven's power.
Right.
There actually is a study by Blasch and Schmidt that have students watch it and then rate which of those power structures, and they put it down to legitimate power and expert power, kind of the 2 that we penned on PhDs.
Yeah.
That which again, you're at a university, you've got this doctor there, he's legitimate as far as you're concerned, but they also have this expert power. He also did other things like brought in multiple teachers, and so even if you have a experimenter, if you have 2 other people like flipping switches with you, and then at like I think it was at 75 volts and 150 volts, each of them gets up and says, "I'm out. I'm not doing this." You also reduce. You see that decrease from something like 66, 70% down to 10, 12%, 15%. You see this other significant reduction. And there are a lot.
Could that be like to de-individuation? Like if you're by yourself and the only witness is like the experimenter, whereas if you're like being watched by 2 other people?
Yeah, I mean, there's also the argument too that kind of I'm just following orders article or argument, or
Mm-hmm.
that if you're, this guy in a lab coat's doing it, if something goes wrong, he's liable, right? I'm not
Right.
actually going to get in trouble for this, even though I'm the one who flipped the switch.
Like a diffusion of responsibility.
Yes, yeah, very much so. He also did a bunch of other ones where he would change the learner from male to female, and they
Mm-hmm.
also find a decrease. We're much less willing to shock a female learner than a male learner. Or you bring the learner into the room with you. So instead of being behind this other glass where you're only listening to them, they have an actor sit in the room and actually act shocked and like talk directly. And if
That's unnerving.
you have to kind of confront this person to their face and still shock them,
Yeah.
it's probably not going to happen as much.
Yeah, the 17 study I found tried to find gender differences in the learner, and they couldn't find them because 90% of the participants went all the way, regardless of the gender. So,
there was probably the one that actually does make it into a couple of the textbooks, because this was the first time, the first place that I had heard of it. There's a researcher, Berger, and in 2009 he replicated the study and replicated it in the US as ethically as possible.
mm-hmm.
And I like talking about this one because of the hoops that he had to jump through to get this study done. So there were basic things like, you've taken a Psych 101 class, you cannot participate in the study because you've heard about it.
Right. You'll know exactly what you're doing as soon as you get there.
He had every participant screened by a clinical psychologist beforehand for proneness to anxiety
Uh-huh.
and stress, which caused something like 25-30% of their participants just not be able to participate.
Right.
They had a much more diverse group, so much more non-white
Mm-hmm.
participants, much more female to male, and a younger, more diverse, because the original study used a lot of like white and blue collar
Mm-hmm.
participants. One of the other big things that he did is he stopped at 150 volts. And the rationale for that was that in the original Milgram studies, or the series of studies, that 150 volts was a pretty good cutoff. If you were going to quit the study, you did so before, and that's about the time the guy's really yelling at you, says he has a
Mm-hmm.
heart condition. If you're going to quit, they found that you're probably going to quit before that.
Right.
That most people breaking that barrier went on. And there was something like 75%. So even if you take that kind of 60, 70, there's some variability there.
Close enough.
Yeah, and they were also much more explicit about your ability to leave the study at any time.
Mm-hmm.
They even removed some of the experimenter prompts that were a little, or perceived to be a little too coercive.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, you must continue. It would just be like, please continue.
Right.
The experiment can only go on if you continue. By kind of rewording it to where it's a little less forceful. But
Uh-huh.
again, they still found a lot of people, the vast majority of them were still willing to hit that 150 and show a willingness to continue. They just had to stop them and said, wait, okay, we're stopping at 150 volts.
Mm-hmm.
The other one that I found was with Haslam, Logan, and Perry. This was 2014. And they did a meta-analysis, and their argument, this will kind of bring us into a leeway on some of the Zimbardo stuff as well, is that they found that the kind of relationship, the interaction that the participant had with the learner or with other teachers was just as at least just as powerful, or at least they argue was just as powerful as the experimenters authority or asserting
Mm-hmm.
their authority. So where, yes, that relationship of this authority figure is important, but we also have to take into consideration like the studies that bring the learner closer or have multiple teachers, that these social bonds that we form with other people that are involved, other participants, were just as important in terms of moving people forward, their willingness to continue or to reject.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Hmm. So overall, a little problematic, but I think it's fair to say that it's standed the test of time.
Yeah, yeah, with the replications, with, again, issues aside. And again, I'll give Zimbardo a lot of leeway on issues with his study too, because we're talking about studies done in the 60s and 70s.
Right. There's no way, like, we know all of this stuff in hindsight.
Yeah, we're a lot stricter on our ethics these days.
Yes.
We're not, and I mean, this is a big step up from like Little Albert 1930s territory, but this isn't, we're not quite to kind of the modern codified APA ethics code of conduct for psychologists. So yeah, generally holds up, replicates fairly well, even when the issues in these original studies are kind of handled. I mean, because a lot of the issues, the real criticisms about dehoaxing, debriefing, standardizing stuff, they're done in these replications. The problem with the Zimbardo study, I guess the first, is that
which one?
there are almost no replications.
Yeah. And there's one really good replication.
There's the big one.
There's the big one.
And then there's some people who have tried to pick apart a couple of these aspects of it. But everything else has more been almost like journalistic investigative work.
Right.
And again, part of that, like with the Milgram study, we know about now because they've opened their archives. Well, the same thing happened with Stanford. Some people got into the archives. They dug through all the papers. They read all the transcripts. And it turns out my narrative of the Zimbardo study is almost nothing.
Right.
Like what may have actually happened.
In one of the papers I found, before we kind of get into debunking the narrative, just at face value, like treating, like let's say that the classic story is true.
Yeah.
There are 5 major criticisms of this study, just discluding the information that we're going to reveal. Okay. So the first one is the ecological validity of the study, which is kind of the idea that it was too short. There's not enough time for the guards and prisoners to really integrate these roles.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's the major one. There's also
I'll put a pin in that because there's a lot in the narrative that might explain why that's criticism.
Right. The second one is one that we kind of touched on briefly by Carnahan and McFarlane, 2007, which is the participant selection bias.
Yes.
So the idea is that, this is actually a big problem with my sex research, or anyone who does sex research too, is that when you're a participant or like an undergraduate picking out, studies to be involved in, you're going to be naturally inclined to choose certain studies over other studies.
Yes.
So for my sex research, I'm going to get more sexually liberal people taking my studies.
We actually find that in the I just finished a video lecture for my research design class talking about volunteer differences. And all of these basic differences go away when you're doing atypical research. You get a very different group of people.
Yeah, I know. If I'm like, hey, take my sex study, like every conservative, if you're high in evangelical Christian, if you're older, if you're more, like you're not going to even click on that link, which means my research suffers. Same thing with prison experiments. You're more likely to get a little bit lower empathy people involved in these studies.
Yeah, they found that if you change the newspaper ad from a prison life study to just saying a study, the people who show up for the prison life study have higher trait aggressiveness, authoritarianism, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and social dominance.
I will say, though, I don't know if this is necessarily a weak. I mean, it's a weakness in that you're randomizing for prisoner versus guard.
Yes.
But if you want to have some high, like, external validity, like, the same people who are showing up to your prison study are probably the same people who are like, hey, I need to get a job really quick. What do I do? I'll go work at the prison down the street.
I'm gonna go work at the prison, or I'm gonna go into, you know, a particular field. And
Mm-hmm.
there's some potential self-selection bias in the fields that we choose.
What? Really?
I mean, sometimes it's the field. I mean, maybe at some point we can talk about like IQ tests and like police hiring practices, because there's some really interesting like court cases and legal cases and some psychology
Mm-hmm.
behind that, like psychology behind IQ and stuff like that. But yeah, like there's this selection, who's showing up. Now, I mean, we will say in this case that he did randomize prisoners and guards. And so, you know, the argument would be, as long as you're randomizing these people within both potential groups, but that also means that you're probably going to get some more assertive, authoritarian prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
But also maybe, you know, if we're talking about like hardened, you know, kind of extreme, you know, not like your minor drug offense criminal, but your, you know, hardened assaulting people left and right criminal, they're probably going to score high on all of these. And also, what they also found lower on empathy and altruism.
Yep. And kind of to piggyback off of this, the third criticism is the demand characteristics of the study. So they ran this is from, I don't even know how to pronounce this, Banu Azizi and Mavahidi, 1975, took the advert for the Zimbardo study and gave it to a group of people in Boston. I think it was undergraduate students, and 80% of them were able to guess what the study was about. And so very likely all of these participants not only self-selected bias to get in, but also when they got in, they probably already knew what was going to happen.
It's also, when we think about this in terms of research, is why we don't always label the surveys that we're asking in the way. It's like, if you label something the sexism scale, people go, "Ooh, this is the sexism scale. I'm not going to be as honest as I normally would be."
Right, because you get into some like, I don't want the researcher to see me as this, or maybe you're like aggressive towards studying people who study sexism, so you're going to go in and like purposely mess up their data.
And then still with the self-selection, if you can kind of figure out what the study's about, you might go, "Oh, I definitely want to be a part of this. I'm just gonna, you know, it's gonna be fun for me."
Number 4 is Zimbardo's dual role, which we kind of already touched on. The idea that he's both supposed to be this like neutral observer out of the room, nobody should know who he is kind of situation, but also having his own role as like the prison superintendent. Mixes up the validity of the study.
That experimenter bias can come in. You kind of have something that you want to see happen, so you might prompt it along. I'll give Zimbardo some credit on this, that he has in interviews said, you know, that is something, you know, that was a problem. He has talked about getting lost in his own role as kind of running this prison, which I at least take as a, you know, a bit of kind of self-awareness, some reflection, like, if we ever were going to do this again, which never happened really, we would, you know, I would have to step back. You know, he would have to step back and let someone else run it, and kind of be able to kind of hit that shutdown button if he needed to, and you know, if you're detached, that's going to be more likely.
And then the last one identifies, like we discussed, the variance in the guard's behavior. So if he was actually picking up an effect, there would have been more conformity in all of the guards. So they would have all been more closely aligned to the John Wayne character. But because the guards showed various levels of authoritarianism and abuse towards the prisoners, that the environment did not specifically elicit the same response, like he argued, in all of the guards. And so we can't just chalk up being in the basement of the psych building as causing all of the guards to become abusive.
Right.
There was a lot of variance in their abuse and how they participated, etc. So it wasn't a uniform effect. So those are the major criticisms if we take the study at face value. So tell us why we probably shouldn't be taking the study at face value.
Well, maybe we can go through the criticisms and talk about the story behind the story. So there are two articles. One is a more journalistic approach written by, let me get his name, Ben Blum. He's actually an author of this story about his own family called Ranger Games, a true story of soldiers' family and an inexplicable crime. One of his cousins went through Ranger training, and so this is how he kind of got involved in the interest in the Zimbardo study. I think it was his cousin, went through Ranger training and was involved in a bank robbery. So basically, like the one of the commanding officers and these like 3 or 4 Rangers took a vehicle to the bank, walked in and robbed it. On trial, he claimed that he thought it was a training exercise, and Zimbardo was actually called in as a witness to basically try to bring the case for the defense that this guy kind of going through Ranger training and seeing a CO and basically kind of following orders was not under kind of complete control and should be given a more lenient sentence. What actually happened in this case is that he got a lenient sentence. It was quite the opposite of what happened to there's another case where Zimbardo very famously testified, and that was at one of the Abu Ghraib prison guards trial. It was one of the lower ranking guards basically came in for the defense and kind of argued the same thing, that it was the environment, the bad environment, this Lucifer effect that he's been promoting since the Stanford Prison Study, influenced the guard and he should not be. But in that case, the judge basically said nope and gave him the maximum sentence. So he's doing, I think it's 8 years is the maximum sentence for his participation. So he's doing 8 years in prison. So he gets involved and he writes it. So I've got that link that's called The Life of a Lie. And the other, and where a lot of the information that kind of supports what he's researching is from Le Texier, T-E-X-I-E-R. It could be Texier, if you want to say it like some Americans say city names. Here in New Mexico, we call Pecos, Pecos. So, it's just how we pronounce things. But he pulled all the transcripts. He read through everything. And he wrote this, for lack of a better word, damning article called Debunking the Stanford Prison Experiment. So he's from France. So I'm probably saying it right. And so he learned a lot. And then in additional, Blum interviewed a lot of the people who had not given interviews in a while. And he got a lot of additional information, stuff that never made it into documentaries, stuff that never was brought up in the 2015 movie that Zimbardo was a consultant on and had been pushing to get made for almost a decade at that point. Probably longer. There's a lot. And a lot that reshapes the narrative about this study. A lot more. And maybe 5 or 6 years from now, we'll have more information from the Milgram study. Maybe other stuff gets read and sifted through and we learn new things. Maybe these replications that were done. But the issues with Milgram weren't necessarily maybe Milgram, maybe willfully, though there does seem to be some definite willful kind of lying about how much the script was followed or how many participants, believed this. And we actually see that in some of Milgram's journals that have been unearthed, is that even he was kind of skeptical at some of his findings. But we do have some replications that kind of support that.
Right.
So I
Poor
guess
Zimbardo.
where should we start? So they say never punch down, so we're going to try to punch up in this this podcast. We always go after someone bigger than us, probably the biggest as
Right.
far as we're concerned in social psychology.
I can tell Zimbardo's senses are tingling right now. He knows we're
Well,
talking about us.
I mean, unless he doesn't
Talking
care
about
anymore,
him.
And that's in the Blum article. He says he'll never do an interview on this again after 2019. And
Mhm.
that he wants its legacy will be how long it has lived and how famous it has become, because that equates to validity.
Right.
So all right, so let's start at the top. Let's go through your criticisms, and I'll see what I could talk about in relation to these.
Okay, so the first one is the ecological validity. So the idea is that the participants did not have enough time to fully integrate into these roles.
So the real story about setting this study up is that it was originally conducted by another student and 15 members of their dorm over 2 days. Zimbardo heard about it and said, we should do this for reals. The student was the one who got appointed as warden, and also is on these transcripts that the Letexier pulled concerning coaching. Now, Zimbardo wasn't the one doing the coaching necessarily, though there were some rules laid out. And the rules of the study, prisoners could only define themselves by their numbers, other aspects of expectations of prisoners and guards, were not pulled from actual prisons.
Mm-hmm.
They were pulled from this student's 2-day mini experiment in their dorm. And a consultation with a former San Quentin prisoner who Zimbardo met through this student, who is on record in interviews saying that a lot of the stuff they did was based on his experiences at San Quentin, not necessarily prison in general.
Right.
Up to the point of the study, Zimbardo had never been inside of a prison, at least according to interviews and an understanding of this. So the study was thrown together based on a 2-day mini experiment by kind of like an undergraduate student who became the warden and got to set the rules for what was going to happen, who also was kind of into prison reform himself. Which again isn't a bad thing. But also
we're kind of going in with a particular narrative.
And is on record. I'll see if I can find the direct quote. Let's see here. Okay. So this is from the article. So basically, when they weren't acting tough enough, Jaffe, Jaffe, explicitly coerced guards who weren't acting tough enough, fostering exactly the pathological behavior that Zimbardo would later claim had arisen organically. The guards have to know that every guard is going to be what we call a tough guard, Jaffe told one such guard. Hopefully, what will come out of this study is some very serious recommendations for reform so that we can get on the media and into the press with it and say, now, look at what this is really about. Try and react as you picture the pigs reacting. End quote. So, little experimenter bias there.
A little bit.
Little bit. And when we actually, I'll move down to, what is it, point 4 was the experimenter bias point. When we're adding to that, it was also noted that they sent information about their study to a couple of news sources on day 2 of the study to promote their study. I don't know if I've ever heard of a researcher doing this.
Yeah.
Like, we usually like to figure
out
our results.
I mean, like right now we're kind of in this space where you like promote your study design before you do it.
Right, but even that, like that sort of pre-publishing process, and that's still done through a journal. There's still a peer review process.
Right.
I'll get to that at the end, because that was probably the most, like, because there's this little drop of information that came out of this article that was probably the most shocking when it comes to the standard process of publication. I mean, even in the 70s, I mean, we haven't changed a whole lot. We've talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't changed a whole lot based on how we used to do things. So that kind of touches on point criticism 1 and 4. There's definitely some experimenter bias. And again, not everyone acted out. A lot of people refused to. On top of this, both the prisoner who had the nervous breakdown is on record saying he faked it.
Yeah.
And when told this, Zimbardo said it was a lie. He's lying. Except that he talks about it in pretty excruciating detail. He says that, he thought he was going into the study with a chance for 14 days to relax in a prison cell and read his GRE books.
Mm-hmm.
He was going to take the GRE. So for those of you who don't know, it's the ACT for grad school, basically, to get into grad school. And
it's terrible.
It's 4 hours plus long. It's miserable. And it's expensive. So he thought
your test grade doesn't improve much the more you take it either.
Mine did.
Did it?
But that was because when I went to take it the first time, the brakes went out on my car, and there were some other problems.
Oh.
So the environment shapes.
The environment shaped it.
But yeah, so he wanted to study, and they refused to give him his books. And so by like day 3, he was kind of looking for a way out because he was worried he was going to fail the GRE.
Fair.
Which, as a prospective grad student, yeah, I'd be freaking out too.
I would have a legit nervous breakdown.
In addition to this, it said that he had asked repeatedly beforehand to leave and was told no. When brought to his attention in this interview, Blum confronts Zimbardo with it, and Zimbardo says, okay, well, it's in the transcripts that this happened. We told him he couldn't leave. He says, well, in the informed consent, there was this line that they had to say a specific phrase, like, I want the experiment to end. And if they didn't say, I want the experiment to end in those words, so if they said something like, I want my mom, I want to be let out, let me go, those aren't the words. And because we have to make this feel like a real prison, like you have to say the safe word.
Right.
And so he goes, okay. And then they went and pulled the informed consent forms. And that's never mentioned.
Oh, no.
So it turns out, and it's actually brought up in this article, they may have had a case for false imprisonment under California law at the time.
Seriously, though.
Because you're asked to leave and then you get put in solitary confinement for 6 hours.
Oh.
Yeah. So
you don't need an APA ethics board to tell you that that's not legit.
Right. It's one of those things that, like, well, we've learned better now. Well, I'm pretty sure we knew better then.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the tip of the iceberg.
Uh-huh.
So what's point 2? So I can see what I could add to this.
So point 2 and 3 build off of each other. So the first one is the participant selection bias, and then the demand characteristics of the experiment, where not only were participants more likely to sign up for this study because it said prison, but also that they pretty much knew what was going to happen before they even went in.
Yeah, so there may have been an understanding with that. The one prisoner, I think his name's Yoki, Y-O-K-I, he who kind of has the breakdown. They kind of learn early on, like, and the first day of the study, they were like, it's great. Like, we know they can't physically hurt us. So we can, they would do stuff like bar the doors with their bed. They'd mess with them. The prisoners were kind of egging them on, and, until the guards were kind of prompted more psychological torture. They also realized that in order to get out, they needed to either basically engage in something that would threaten them physically or psychologically. And so that's when you started seeing this realization, like, oh, like, I don't really want to do this. This isn't what I thought. This is pretty terrible. So I'm going to pretend to have a nervous breakdown, or I'm going to go on a hunger strike, because they can't keep me here if I might endanger myself. And so if I do this, if I just refuse to eat, they're going to have to let me go at some point.
Right.
Yeah. We also find that Eshelman, John Wayne, was trying out some acting chops. He's really interested in acting. He even admits in an interview, like one of the big documentary interviews, he had just seen Cool Hand Luke. This is a show about, it's a movie about prison. And he was emulating the Southern Guard. His Southern accent was fake. He does not have a Southern accent.
Oh.
So he's not from the South. And so he's basically, he saw it as a chance to improve his improv skills. And again, he's on record talking about this. Like he did not see it as a serious, again, like those Milgram participants who didn't see it as a real thing. Someone who sees through what you're trying to do can then kind of use it for their own benefit. And so, and kind of combine that with the warden telling them, like, you're going to be a tough guard. And he's like, I can play that role. I'll put on my best Southern accent and go in and do whatever, play this kind of gruff prison warden, and I'll give him hell. And so again, you could argue that he is adopting a role, but he's not adopting a role, kind of under the environmental pressures that Zimbardo's arguing.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of his own personal motive to get some like immersion acting experience. Right.
Trying to gain some personal benefit from this and get paid for it. $15 a day.
He might as well be a Confederate in that situation.
Right. Yeah. And again, that's kind of the argument is that at least the guards, if you're being coached, and there's this kind of like famous Saturday briefing that they talk about in these, where they were given kind of laid down the law, like, this is how we're going to do it. These are the rules of the prison. Like, we're telling you exactly what to do. We are giving you this predefined information. Yes, we're making some of this stuff kind of real. We're sending people to arrest you, but we are giving you the information on how we expect you to act. Because again, you can't really conform to a system that has existed for centuries. We're talking about the American prison system. You can't conform to that overnight. In the same way that if we're trying to use something like this to explain Nazis at concentration camps, the Nazis working at the concentration camps didn't become heartless, terrible people overnight. Now, some of them may have just started off as sociopaths. But, that guard who may not have been, that average Joe guard who decided, I'm just going to stick around and keep doing this, may have over time, because this is just how it is, or they've rationalized to themselves, or, chain of command, the Fuhrer says that this is what we should be doing. It's all in defense of my homeland. It's all for freedom, or my freedom at least. It takes time for these kind of systems to have an impact on. And
like anti-Semitism in Germany was rampant for centuries before that even happened.
Right.
So it was already ideologically in line.
Yeah, they became a scapegoat. I mean, we're talking about that. They became a scapegoat for other social ills, much in the same way. Again, when we talk about analogs of, hey, we're having a problem with the economy, let's blame a relatively powerless group, or let's blame this easily identifiable group, like immigrants. And so, again, in no way do I think we would, kind of defend the prison system. A lot of problems there. It's the, I guess, argument that, and the real argument that comes out of this study, and I guess one of the big criticisms that people have with it, even if they want to use it as a teachable lesson, is that it does kind of put all of the weight on the environment. It's saying that these guards behaved badly, not because of personal choice, not because of any innate history that they might have, but because of the situation. And I guess to some extent, maybe that is true when you have the guy playing the warden telling you to be a tough guy and to engage and, give you ideas on what to do. And you're given these examples from this guy who served time at San Quentin and may have seen some terrible behavior on behalf of, guards interacting with prisoners. Not to say that prison in the 70s was nice or prison in general is a good place to be. But you know, there is those expectations are playing in, but they're definitely on the part of the guards and the prisoners. There was a choice made by many of them.
Mm-hmm.
And many of them didn't act out. Many of them didn't misbehave. Many of them didn't get aggressive. But those who did, you know, almost when they talk about it, at least when they're interviewed, they talk about it as terms of they made an active decision to behave this way.
Right. I think one of the things kind of building off of the guards and prisoner dynamic that was kind of illuminated further was with the BBC replication.
This is Riker and Haslam 2006.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look this up, there is a Zimbardo response to it, which basically boils down to this should not be taken seriously in psychology. It is a completely invalid study. These people are terrible because they didn't exactly 100% replicate my study.
Right. And I think there is something to say. I mean, like, because the BBC study went longer than Zimbardo's did.
Yes.
Because it wasn't as psychologically traumatizing. But I think there is still something to say about the environment shaping the behavior based off of that study. And they also had more of a social identity perspective going into this too.
Yeah.
Without like the training that Zimbardo provided.
Right. Yeah. They purposely had the people show up on their own so they weren't arrested. That was one of Zimbardo's big criticisms. But they also didn't debrief, like they didn't really give them any preconceived rules. There was no initial briefing. There was basically, you're in this role, you're in that role, do your thing.
Do your thing. And so, like, I think that there's still some merit. But one of the things that I found fascinating with the BBC replication was that when you let it go on longer than Zimbardo did, the prisoner revolt turns into like a deconstruction of authority, because they essentially make a commune amongst the prisoners and the guards. And it was only shut down because a small group, I believe it was prisoners, like 2 or 3 of them were like, we're going to have a takeover of this commune and like make it authoritarian again. And so you kind of get to watch the development, like the standard development of like, okay, here's kind of our preconception of what we're supposed to be doing. Here's our power dynamic. This goes on for a little while. And then you start to humanize each other through that process and it becomes a commune. And then authoritarianism sneaks back in.
Yeah, and one of the things that they found, or at least they argued, was that it was kind of their identity with the researchers.
Mm-hmm.
And that if you think of yourself as a researcher because you're on the guard side, that may prompt it more, because you're not a participant, you're a Confederate in this study. You have that authority, you're in that position of power because you're in good with the researcher. And kind of in Zimbardo studies, if you were one of the guards, you were kind of in good with the researcher. You got to meet with them, you got to talk with them, they did debriefings with you, but you didn't get that if you were the prisoner. I do believe they found that one kind of replication criticism study that when asked, these participants did rate themselves as feeling kind of more like an experimenter, or feeling that they were more involved in the study than they were actually supposed to be.
So, you know, you clear away all the crap from Zimbardo, like there is still a pretty good study there that speaks to this issue. It's just, you know, he's a little...
Yeah, I mean, especially if you have an issue of some of the people in the group deciding like, no, we're going to make it authoritarian again.
Mm-hmm.
What is it about them compared to the people who are willing to work together? You know, try to have a decent environment, or try to set a set of standards or norms, rules, privileges that everyone can benefit from. You know, we get this, we'll behave. And so as long as everyone's got an understanding, the one thing. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was about to say, are you gonna tell me how they
Yes.
published this research? Did they like invent the internet in the 60s just so they could put it on Blogspot?
Oh, if only. If only. So I'll say with this, part of the reason Zimbardo's study took off is that it kind of happened at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
because about a week or two after the study concluded, there was some issues, I believe, at San Quentin, and there was the Attica kind of riots. There were hostages taken. Eventually, the governor called in basically the guard, and they dropped tear gas into the complex. They then opened fire into the smoke, and they killed prisoners and hostages alike. And so the topic of prison issues exploded.
Mm-hmm.
And guess who had just finished a study funded by a naval research grant on prisoner guard behavior, who had also kind of put out a little press release 2 days into the study,
Right.
and who originally published the findings in the New York Times, not in a peer-reviewed journal. And actually, if you go and look up the original study, it is a naval research grant publication. Like, it has like naval research on it. It was not published initially in a peer-reviewed journal. There was no peer review done with this.
Wow.
And it had, now, I mean, over time, and that's kind of what these follow-up studies and these criticisms,
Right.
and for the most part, Zimbardo has been pretty open to these criticisms. For the most part, when that Riker and Haslam study came out in 2006, apparently he had been working behind the scenes for almost a year, trying to discredit them and get it thrown out. I mean, he actually says in his paper that, like, this study should be ignored and rejected by the British psychological community as well as the American psychological community and everyone else. Like, not telling you to kind of read it and take the facts and maybe kind of debunking it, but just straight up trying to say, like, you shouldn't even consider this.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out he's also trying to get a film made at the time, and there's some other stuff. But there does seem to be, I mean, besides what like Jaffe tells that guard that's in the transcripts of, like, hey, we're going to get on the media because of this, and then, you know, those prison issues happen, that you kind of become a big name because of this.
Right.
And so it just kind of adds to the issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so while it's hard to kind of compare these two individuals completely, because Zimbardo has 40 or 35 years on Milgram. There are some things that I do take from this that specifically the Blum article that made me really think. One was sort of like this is, he makes a lot of statements about the fact that, like, you can criticize it. Letessier can say that it's a hoax, that he can say it's debunked, but this has existed for 50 years, and that's proof that it's worth something, which, again, time does not equate to validity. Just because something's famous does not mean that it was good. There are plenty of famous people who are not good. There are plenty of really famous events that were terrible.
Well, I mean, I will say, though, kind of the inception and the treatment of the study and the organization of it, and kind of the, like, we're going to get in the media for this, we're going to do our press release. Like, I don't know if a psychologically valid study was the goal. If,
Right.
in hindsight, he's like, the legacy lives for itself. And I'm like, well, this guy tried to shut down a study because he was trying to make a movie. He gets irate at interviews. His whole, like, he should have known better than to run that study. So my assumption is that Zimbardo is correct in saying that this was a successful study because of its fame. Because
Right.
I think that was the function of the study, was to make him famous.
There does seem to be a component of that, especially
Yeah.
with the publication process and things like that. But what also strikes me is kind of the reverse of this, because this is what he says in that Blum interview. It's about a 30-minute read, but this is kind of the end of it. It says, Zimbardo has spent much of his last 50 years answering questions about the darkest 6 days of his life. In some ways, a prisoner of his own experiment success. When I asked him if he was glad, looking back, to have conducted the study, he said he had mixed feelings. He considered the shyness clinic, so he did helped form the Shyness Clinic in Palo Alto in 1975. He actually says that he feels that that's his most important work, and arguably, it's honestly a more important initiative.
Mhm.
And so, if it was not for the prison study, that would be my legacy, he said. Does some part of you wish that were your legacy? I asked. Yeah, sure, he said. Of course, that's positive. The prison study, the negative part is I am Dr. Evil. I created this evil situation, like Svengali or something. In Zimbardo's telling, he too is a victim of circumstance, shaped by his surroundings like everyone else. I gradually, with a lack of awareness, transformed myself into being prison superintendent, he said. Why? My office had the sign prison superintendent. David Jaffe's office said warden. Then I had to deal with the parents. I had to deal with the parole board hearings. I had to deal with the priest coming in. People are dealing with me not as a researcher, but as the prison superintendent, asking for help with their prisoner's son. This excuse has served Zimbardo as well as anyone else over the years, but it may no longer be enough. After reviewing some of Letexier's evidence, textbook author Greg Feist, this is a guy who had been teaching Zimbardo and keeps putting the basic story into his book, told me that he has considered taking a firmer stand in the forthcoming edition of Psychology, Perspectives, and Connections. I hope there does come a point now that we know what we do, where Zimbardo's narrative dies, Feist says. Unfortunately, it's not going to happen soon, but hopefully it will happen, because I just think it's Feist paused, searching for the appropriate word, then settled on a simple one. It's a lie. And it's just a really, like, that hit me today finishing that article.
Yeah.
But it does kind of shape this, that maybe there was this background to it. Maybe there wasn't originally an attempt to kind of make it big, but when you realize you're suddenly called on for interviews, you're asked to do, Zimbardo is actually part of this great PBS series that talks about kind of perspectives in psychology. He's helped to write, this widely used psychology textbook that he's a author on. When all that kind of comes to you and you realize, like, could I lose all of this?
Mm-hmm.
Again, that kind of concept of you becoming a product of maybe this environment that you made for yourself. So
Yeah. I want to spend a second to pat ourselves in the back. So in this Bartels 2016 article that has the major criticisms of this study, they ran a study of psychology instructors, 117 of them, and asked them how they treat this subject in their classes. And so 65% of these instructors, do you want to guess how many minutes they on average spent on this subject?
30? 20. Okay.
20 minutes.
That's a lot of time for a class, I will say.
And 7% added additional materials beyond the original story. And when it comes to the 5 criticisms, these are the percentage breakdowns from highest to lowest. So the number 1 criticism brought up in class by the instructor is Zimbardo's dual role, which was at 47% of the instructors.
All right. I talk about that. I'm going to see how bad I am normally. Not this semester.
Even half. Not even half,
Okay.
And that's the highest one.
I do talk about that, so okay.
Number 2 is the demand characteristics of the study at 37%.
Okay.
The variance in guard behavior was at 36%. The participant selection bias was 26%. Oh, and then the ecology validity was at 28%. So about a third of, 65% of teachers spend less than 20 minutes on this study. Only 7% include additional information like we have tonight. And then when it comes to outlining the criticisms of the study, only about a third of teachers actually include the criticisms. So I think Zimbardo is correct in saying that it was a successful study because of its fame.
Yeah. Social perception and like the general perception of how people view it will allow it to continue to live on generally positively. Because again, I mean, how much time do you have in a Psych 101 class to talk about this?
Mm-hmm.
This is
I would spend I would probably do what we just, actually, I do what we did to this evening. Like I do Milgram and Stanford.
I guess if you're not maybe like lecturing from the book, you can just be like, all right, this is what we're going to talk about in this class. You should have read everything else yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the way to go. So I'll, in wanting to change, because ultimately what the authors of that paper are kind of asking, and what I see, and there's another paper that talks about the discussion of Zimbardo study in criminal justice, which kind of shows even less, like everyone talks about it. It's cited in the research, but even when it's critical, there's a huge agreement with its findings.
Mm-hmm.
And they argue that it should be taught as a way to discuss skepticism and problems in research and things like that. So in order to get over that, I will bring up our concluding bias of the podcast.
Bias of the week!
Samuelson and Zeckhauser, 1988, status quo bias. The tendency to like things to stay relatively the same in favor of decisions that maintain the status quo. And the status quo is that Milgram study is what it is, Zimbardo study is what it was, and that's what we're going to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
We've tried to break that. We tried to talk about some of the problems, and that's really kind of scratching the surface on some of these issues. Like and that's why the status quo bias is going to be tough, because in order to understand a lot more nuance and depth and the issues involved in these studies, and then also to kind of again understand what works and what didn't, what replications were effective, what have more recent findings found, what can we maybe predict to find in the next decade if we're going to maybe do something like this again.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a lot of time.
Yep.
That's why we're recording this on a Friday instead of a Wednesday.
Mm-hmm.
That and power outages and birthdays and other stuff. So
Right. So lessons to the students listening. 1, you have more information about these studies, which means you're not going to be popular when you talk about them.
yes.
Because people love these studies.
Though, I mean, if you want to be that, but actually.
Yeah, no,
that,
we've turned you all into, but actually people.
But you'll come across someone at some point who's like, there are these problems with this study, and that's the problem with psychology. You go, well, actually, psychology has tried to address these studies, and we are super critical of them.
And that's kind of my second point, is that always be wary of psychologists who have clear-cut absolutist answers about things.
Yeah, we do that's another topic we need to bring up at some point. We do really like absolutist answers. It's easy.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, that if you come and ask me, why is this the case? I'm like, well, it could be this, it could be that, it could be this, it could be this.
This person disagrees. This person agrees, kind of.
Here's 8 possibilities.
Then there's this new work that totally throws out this model and looks at it in a different way. I don't know. Right. Nothing matters. We're all going to die.
Yeah, I like talking to the clinical graduate students and then the program where I'm teaching now, because I get to hear about these new clinical therapies that are coming out. There's one that it shouldn't work. As far as anyone was concerned, it doesn't make any sense why it should work, but it works, and it turns out it's pretty effective.
Is it the eye movement one?
Yes, it is the eye movement. Yes.
Yeah, no, that's nuts.
When we get to talking about intro psych, I think that'll be our season 2.
Yeah.
When we get to clinical psychology, I'm going to bring someone on to talk about it, because someone who I know has written full research, graduate, class research papers on it. So they've done their homework, just because it's so fascinating. But we might find out, it's better than CBT in some cases. We might find out that it's maybe there's just something even more out there that works. That's just the nature of science. We are changing, we are evolving, we are adjusting, and that is good science. And so when we're criticizing and we're tearing down to rebuild up these concepts, it's to build discussion and to help us learn more. So
keep it fresh.
So with that, this is our longest podcast yet.
Happy midterm, guys.
Yeah. The midterm, you might get scheduled for a midterm or a final longer than the regular class. So we hope everyone enjoyed this. I know we really enjoyed it. I know I really enjoyed it. I can't speak for both of us completely.
Oh no, this has been a blast. I kind of want to go through like maybe do another episode like later on, maybe in our intro season, do like our favorite unethical studies.
I've got a list.
I do too.
I've got a list that I talk about when I discuss ethics, and yeah, I would love to do that.
That would be way fun. See
it'd be a
who
good
can find the most unethical study.
It'd be a good chapter 1. So that'd
It'd be a good chapter 1.
Chapter 1, season 2. Chapter 2, season 2. So, but until then, next time we're gonna have a special guest, and we're gonna talk about aggression.
Nice.
And video games and
Pornography.
Pornography.
I'm here. Of course, we're going to talk about porn.
I'm gonna have to mark this one not safe for work. The next one, this one I think is fine. So until then, goodbye.
See y'all.